And hello, everybody. Welcome back. This time, risk management. Hey, I always like to start, if I can, with a great quote. I think I've used John Wooden before. He led UCLA, I think it was, to like seven or some crazy number of national basketball championships. Knows what he's talking about when it comes to motivation. Great project manager, I'd say. Never mistake, he would say, activity for achievement, right? Don't you love that? Okay, we are on risk management. So, previous versions of the PMBOK guides 1 through 6, broke risk management down into these various processes. Now, the PMBOK Guide Edition 7 uses the same concept, so nothing has gone away. They still use the tools, it's true, but at the same time, they've gone away from the process focus, even though they'll talk about the processes and the terms here. So this is just a cleaner format. Remember, the objective of risk management is to optimize the chances of your project success. That's what we've been working for anyhow, and risks should keep you up at night. In fact, when people say to me, "What keeps you up at night?" Usually it's a risk that does, because a risk, by its simplest definition, is an uncertainty. You don't know if it'll happen. It's why we get car insurance, right? Because we don't know. Why would we pay for something we're not using, right? We don't know if we'll have an accident. It's a risk, it's an uncertainty. But if the uncertainty becomes a reality, the financial impact to us could be devastating. So we minimize that risk by having insurance. Now, so we're using risk management to optimize our chances of success. We want to increase positive risks. We call them opportunities, actually. And like maybe having great estimates, better estimates reduces your risk. Now, we want to decrease negative risks. So you want to increase positive risks, decrease negative risks, or sometimes we call them threats. Threats is another term for negative risks. Again, by, for example, reducing estimates, using checklists, doing peer reviews, things like that. Now, the process is kind of break it down this way. You always want to plan for risk on your project, whatever you're doing. If it's tower climbing, you really want to plan for risk. Where are emergency numbers? Who is the first and second point of contact? How would you manage emergency situations, etc.? And so you'll want to then, after you plan risk, identify all of the risks. And we're going to put those in a risk register this week. So by identifying all the risks, we're going to put them in a risk register. More on that in a little bit. Then formal project management is going to do qualitative analysis, where we actually apply kind of a subjective probability and impact in order to prioritize all of these risks that we just identified. Of course, as we identify risks, they're not all the same, right? So they're all risks, but some are more important than others, right? So we want to prioritize them first, no matter how you do it. Formally, it's called qualitative analysis, but the key is prioritize your risks. They're not all the same. You can do quantitative analysis if you have some risk that is really big. Maybe you're climbing a tower to install a satellite dish in January in an ice storm at night, right? You'd want to do some sort of really number crunching with real data, not the subjective data, which is pretty good. You're a subject matter expert. So, subjective data, subjective probability and impact to prioritize the risks in the risk register, it's good. It's only meant to prioritize the risks. For some of the really big ones, I'd turn to my company and say, have you quantified these risks? They're big ones. And then, of course, you plan your risk responses, implement them if you need them, which means looking for triggers. You look for triggers so you can see the risk coming and get ahead of it. I mean, you did go ahead and plan it already. And that means constantly monitoring risks, maybe retiring risks that are no longer a problem. Maybe it's in January, but it warmed up to 80 degrees. the ice is no longer an issue. So you can retire a risk as well as always looking for new ones along the way. Now, um, uh, there are lots of ways to reduce risk. And I just mentioned on the previous slide, better estimates is one great way when we're talking about scope, schedule, cost, resource management, that sort of thing. So remember, as a project manager, you're focused on preventing problems. And that means these risks, which I defined earlier as an uncertainty, which is either a threat, which is negative, or an opportunity, which is positive. So you want to create opportunities, increase those risk opportunities. What do I mean by risk opportunity? Well, maybe you can do a joint venture with somebody, right, who has a particular talent. Maybe you're going out to a particularly difficult tower job, right, installing satellite dishes, and you need somebody with an expertise of somebody that's been up to 400 feet, right? The rest of your crew's only been up to 120 feet or something, right? So you want to create that opportunity. You also want to reduce threats. So increase opportunities, reduce threats, right? Run your checklist, have an emergency plan, have a buddy system, work together, nobody left alone, et cetera, et cetera. And so reducing estimates is just one example of a way in resource management, for example, that we can use to reduce risks, or in cost management, or in schedule management. These are just examples. I would like to point out the overall definition of risk management, which is really interesting because it's all of this tied together. So risk management means planning. Risk management is the process of identifying and evaluating and planning risk responses. And so much of what we've already just talked about is covered here. So risk management, which involves planning, right? Risk management is the process of identifying and evaluating. And those are those processes 2 slides ago we just talked about. Identify risks, perform qualitative analysis to prioritize those risks identified, and then for a few, ask your company if they wanted to do quantitative analysis, a deeper study, more than you have time for. And then, of course, planning your responses, which means plan the actual risk response and implement the response if required, which involves both creating value or opportunities and reducing threats, which take away our value of our project to the company. And then, of course, always monitor. So risk management, in the end, in a nutshell, is the process of identifying, evaluating, and planning risk responses. And it involves all these processes in the yellow boxes that we had just talked about here. So in a picture, I'm showing you how the definition of risk management applies to those processes. It's the same thing. Now, whenever you're involved with risk, we're back to stakeholder management. Yes, you are never getting away. Remember, there are multiple means to success on your project, and they're usually inclusive. So one we talked about was that iron triangle: scope, schedule, cost, keeping them in balance. Another we said was meeting the needs or satisfying the stakeholders. So even in risk management, we come back to stakeholders and are they satisfied? And what you have to realize is that stakeholders have a sense of risk. And so if they're happy to do something, it's a little risk, but they do it every day, like drive to work, right? We call this a risk appetite, stakeholder risk appetite. Now, there's some things above the appetite that we're willing to do if we have mitigations in place, right? If you're going to be working 6 feet off the ground, you've got a harness, it's strapped to a pole that won't fall down, that catches you, right? So that would be a risk tolerance. You could expand your daily appetite to this risk tolerance because you took some mitigations. But then there's a stakeholder risk threshold. That is the area about which you would never go, no matter how many mitigations You just won't do it. Now, this stakeholder, this could be you. You have an appetite as the project manager. You have a risk tolerance and you have a threshold, right? Based on this probability and impact. But so does your boss, and so does your company and its culture. So that's a lot to consider now, and it gets very complicated. But the bottom line is stakeholders, you, your boss, the company, the team members, they have risk appetites, they have risk tolerance, and they have risk thresholds. Be aware of those. Okay, there are other types of risks. I just wanted to throw out a few key terms. There's the business risk. So your project has to return some value to the company. So the CBA is cost benefit analysis. Can you ensure that you are ensuring a gain for your company? Otherwise, it's a business risk. There's, of course, pure risk, the risk of just loss, and usually insurance or insurability takes care of that. Now, there are also risks in terms of variability and ambiguity, right? Variability risk is like the weather. The weather varies. It's a risk. Even though it's 20% chance of rain, we know it probably won't, right? So it's variable. There is also ambiguity risk, right? When we have imperfect knowledge, it's going to affect the objectives because we have this with imperfect knowledge, a lack of understanding. That's ambiguity risk. And here are some examples. So these are just some other risk terms that we don't use very often, but to be a great project manager, you should be able to consider them. Now, there's also project resilience. As project managers, we address risk, both threats and opportunities, because we want to ensure the resilience of our project, that it can continue even as new risks emerge, right? What about the risks we hadn't considered? Those would be unknowable unknowns, right? We didn't know it was out there. We couldn't see it coming, right? And so there are lots of ways that we can work around that for your consideration. Now, I did want to mention that one of the keys this week is the risk register. So I'm going to ask you to watch a video probably a few times. It's a great video, very interesting, and identify risk, right? You all have a sense of risk. Identify risks and use the risk register provided, right? List the risks. In the risk register, we try to list all the risks. We're always updating it. It's not a once and done, right? We'll also write down, and you should too in your assignment, who might be a potential owner, who might be what might be potential responses. Remember, we haven't planned the responses yet, so they could change. But right away, when we write the risk down, we want to identify all the risks, potential owners, potential responses. Doesn't have to be the final response yet. Your team will plan that. And maybe even begin to categorize risks, right? So a category of risk might be, if you're building a house, might be water. And water could account for hurricanes, pipes that leak, thunderstorms, other types of water events. You may even list the source of the risk and a potential root cause. So you'll keep this sort of risk report going. Focus on the risk register this week. In fact, here is a picture of one from the Excel spreadsheet, the tools for project management supervisors. Use this, tab 9. Notice the category, right? You want to categorize your risks. You want to try and identify the probability and the impact. So if it's a hurricane and I'm building a house, in August, it has a high probability and even a higher impact if it happens. But in November, that would drop significantly. So that would change, and you could even retire that risk later. But notice we note who's the owner, what might be a contingency plan. Go ahead and take a chance, and the trigger as well, right? So this is just kind of a summary of the whole process. This is really a summary of slide 2 again, where we plan risk, and then we identify all the risks and put it in our risk register. And we create these risk categories I mentioned. Then we do qualitative risk analysis, which is a subjective probability and impact just to prioritize our risk. Then we will do quantitative on some, but really that's over to the company. We'll plan risk responses, looking for triggers, implement, and monitor. Okay, we'll come back for part 2 in a moment.